So this video is actually had something to do with the protests that have been going on this year. So I'm going to name specifically like Colombia, Cuba, and Thailand. And basically these three countries have been seeing a lot of the protests going on. And these protests have usually something to do with the government handling of the coronavirus. That's what the protests have been about over the past 2 years since the 2019 breakout of the COVID. So this video is actually has nothing to do with the politics of the protests and the politicization of the COVID handling, but it's how mainstream news networks, especially privately owned news networks, cover the protests. And when they cover the protests, they usually act as an armed wing of a government organization, the government, or a non-government organization or NGO. So, and then they usually act as like a smear campaign. So, Colombia this year, there was a huge protests, especially the one in Cali, and they were protesting against their president who enforced a tax law that would increase taxes, and his incompetence of handling of the coronavirus cases and the coronavirus itself too. And there was a huge crackdown of protests by the police, and not to mention that the president himself has given the green light to enforce a huge massive crackdown and suppressing the protests. And he has made an order of arrests of over like more than 100, and which is why I'm gonna get there, which is why I'm gonna make the comparison. So which is why I'm gonna get to Cuba. So in Cuba, the protests have been about the blocking of remittance from the US to Cuba, and also the lack of resources of handling the COVID pandemic. Because even though that Cuba had developed a vaccine, they couldn't get it through because due to the embargo and the sanctions imposed by the US. And so because their money is relied on tourism has been blocked, because especially during the pandemic, Cuba wasn't able to really get things through. So that's what the protests have been about. And the impression that is like the people who I believe are misinformed are saying that like this protest is about freedom, or they're protesting against the government. But these mainstream news outlets are making a twist. But the protests that have been covered by state-run media in South America, and most likely the leftist media, who the right-wing Cubans have made a twist in saying that the left is making a dire spin-off, is actually closer to the truth. Because mainstream news outlets have been covering the protests, and they said that like it's the will of the Cuban people in support of a regime change. But while in fact, if you actually look deeper, or look at the other way around of what's going on, what happened in the Cuban protests, they actually are in support of their government. And there was even been videos in Twitter and even in Facebook. I haven't seen one on Instagram, but their president was supporting the in solidarity with the Cuban people in terms of for things to change from the embargo. And this Cuban president himself didn't had any entourage or bodyguards when he rallied and protest with the people. And imagine if any president of any powerful country, like here in the U.S., went out and protested with the people without any bodyguards or entourage. It's probably a different story. And so there had been arrests of less than a dozen, and only 2 police officers were sanctioned just because they made an arrest. And then there had been, in the protests in Colombia, about more than 1,000 had died from the protests, and more than 100, close to 200, as of from July, were detained. And where was the call for sanctions against Colombian police back then from the US State Department or even the president himself? And it's ironically hypocritical, because in the response of the protests in Colombia, the president himself, sounded like he was supporting the fascistic government, while he condemned the Cuban government when the Cuban protests were, going on. And the way that this radical Cuban exiles, they try to make things overreact, while even a small simple tackle by a police officer, they're gonna make a huge deal out of it, while so many protests here in the US are always sabotaged, or they are so violently suppressed like the ones in Colombia, but there's no outrage about it from all sides. And now this leads me to Thailand. The protests in Thailand have been going on for over the past few months, and I think this is the most ignored protest so far. And several mainstream news networks, especially the ones privately owned, like the ones that are also even worth like billions, hadn't been covering the protests. I'm not gonna drag the name, but the only U.S. news network that had been covering the Thailand protests I saw so far was Voice of America, and they've talked from all sides of the view of what's really the situation going on in the protests in Thailand. And now that leads me to the fact that don't fall for any narrative, because when you actually look at the protests and how they're being covered, be careful in whether or not if it's a smear campaign. Doesn't matter what side you're on, or if it's government or non-government or any government organization. So that's why and careful on what news network is covering the protests. So in Thailand, it's just about the same thing. And the protests have been about their prime minister and his lack of handling of the coronavirus. And as I'm recording this, about close to 100 have been arrested and detained. So these protests have been rarely covered in the mainstream news outlets. So I will also send you the link below on the situation at hand of what's going on in the protests. So about the protests in Colombia, you noticed how like top 5 news networks, television networks especially, have been rarely covering the Colombian protests. So there's a red flag there when these TV news networks rarely are covering the protests. Based on some footages seen in the protests this year out of these 3 countries, the Colombian protests have been the deadliest among these 3. The Thailand protests were, I think, the second, and then the Cuban protests were not very deadly like these 2 protests. So wherever you are in the world, always support in solidarity with the people and support them in where there is lack of competence within the country. And if you love to support your country and its government and how it's been treating you well and how they have handled in the pandemic, then I salute you. So just keep fighting on, and no matter what part of the world that you're in.